I would like to introduce Brendan Montague, who is going to speak for 10 minutes. He is a member of RS21 and he's the editor of The Ecologist, which has tackled the issues around COVID-19, as well as the climate crisis and other environmental issues. So Lou's job is timekeeping. So once Brendan's spoken for 8 minutes, he's going to interrupt and tell him he's got 2 more minutes. The same thing goes throughout. Lou will let us know about timekeeping. I'd like to welcome Brendan.
Hello, everyone.
Thanks, Brendan. Hi.
Yeah, I'm speaking as editor of The Ecologist and also, I guess, in a personal capacity. I wanted to thank the organisers for inviting me to speak. The thing that I've written is actually far too long, but I have published the article or the talk at The Ecologist, and you can see it there, and I've also added it to notes. So what I'm about to present is a very brief overview of what I put together, and I would very much welcome comments. So the editor was founded in response to the Club of Rome report, Limits to Growth, in the 1970s. And this was one of the first alerts that industrial capitalism, if it was left to its own devices, would exhaust both the natural resources used to produce what we need and also the sinks for pollution. We published something called the Blueprint of Survival, which was hugely popular and influential. All those publications were based on systems theory, so I've been reading into that and learning more about that. And systems theory begins, some argue, with Hegel's Science of Logic and Encyclopedia. So I've been reading that and learning about Marx's use of systems theory and ecological writings through that lens. And obviously a key influence has been John Bellamy Foster. And I've been watching David Harvey's YouTube videos on capital with a greater understanding of systems thinking. And the point I want to make today is that capitalism is a virus. It is the virus. And I'm almost going as far as to say that's a literal statement, but I would begin with the fact using this as a metaphor and coming to that conclusion from an understanding of systems theory. So a virus is essentially a string of DNA encased in protein. The virus enters an organic body and changes the behavior of that body, so that body reproduces the virus DNA. So that's what people are suffering when they suffer from coronavirus. For some people, that is enough to say that the virus is a living thing. It's self-replicating. And what we also know is that it grows exponentially. Other people argue that because the virus doesn't produce its own energy, it doesn't have a metabolism, it's not a living thing. But that's quite a philosophical debate. So for me, this is the perfect metaphor for capitalism. Capitalism has a DNA, it enters the body politic and it changes the body politic so that the priority of that body becomes reproducing capital and is no longer the interests of the people, the biology, the humans that make up that population. And for me, Marx identified the DNA of capitalism in the MCM DNA. So money, commodity, money. So whereas other societies, or at least logically other things, you would create a commodity as a human being, you would bring that to market, exchange it for money, and then you'd exchange it for another commodity, which makes perfect sense. If you create a lot of wheat, you might want to exchange that and get some fruit. Where capitalism begins is where that is reversed, where the virus is let loose, the origin, logical origin of capital is where you have money, you create a commodity, and then you sell it. And of course, there's no point living in that relation unless you make more money than you began with. So this is where capitalism becomes exponential and self-making. In a sense, it comes alive. So the other thing that Marx argues about in the logic of capital is that there are two things within the commodity in that relation. One is human labor and one is natural resources. So as capitalism grows exponentially, it needs more human labor and it needs more natural resources. And that is hardwired into the DNA of capitalism. Capitalism can't escape those material realities. I think this is a really useful argument because We did a recent survey of ecologist readers, and 60% understood that the primary driver of ecological destruction was neoliberal free market capitalism. But only 20% argued that it was capitalism per se. So there's quite a gap. And what we also need to consider is that 33% roughly believe that humans themselves were the problem, humans are the virus, and that population needs to be controlled. So it's sort of fundamentally important that we are able to present an argument that there is something inherent to capitalism, there's something within the DNA of capitalism that is both destructive of the natural environment and a driver and a cause of colonialism. So in the article, I take that sort of theoretical base and I do a sort of whistle-stop tour of the history of capital, which many of you will be familiar with. And I certainly don't have time to run through now, but some particular points that I found interesting is that the deforestation of the United Kingdom or the Britain began with the origins of capital. Those trees were cut down, brought to London, burned and used to create pig iron. So the ecological destruction of sort of original nature or a form of early nature within the UK was necessary for the foundation of capitalism. And it was also done by the arms industry. It wasn't done by industry in general or technology in general or humans in general or even the British in general. It was a very specific moment in our history. And obviously that pig iron was used to make cannon and guns to colonialize the rest of the world. And as we look through history, as we look through British colonialism, it's robbery of natural wealth and also bondage and slavery of the human beings, which goes back to that original DNA of capital needing both human labour and natural resources. And I was quite surprised learning about the early history of the colonisation of the United States by the British and the Europeans is that the whole of the US was completely covered in forest. So when we committed genocide against the Native Americans, we also destroyed their natural environment. And those two things, again, went hand in hand. And moving forward, the sort of middle stages of capitalism was about the transfer from the use of wood as the primary energy source to the use of oil. And what we see is that even as early as the 1960s, the oil companies became aware, companies like Shell became acutely aware that the use of fossil fuels, the use of oil and gas was driving climate change. But because capital had entered the human psyche, as it were, or human civilizations and society, the priority was not the interest of the human beings or the society at large. The interest that we followed was the interest of capital. And then we see, of course, the explosion of coronavirus in what hopefully is the end chapter of capitalism. I say hopefully, it depends how it actually ends. And what was particularly interesting to me is that there's an argument that coronavirus is a very direct outcome of logging and the continued exploitation of the natural environment in China, and of course a form of colonialization, the appropriation of Chinese labor and natural resources into commodities which are bought and sold in Europe and the United States and the rest of the world.
8 minutes, comrade, 2 more.
Thanks. So logging causes stress in the bat community, which makes them more vulnerable to viruses. That's where the coronavirus originated and was incubated. And it's also through meat and agriculture, the animal agriculture, that virus moved from animals into humans. And further, it's because of our infrastructure, the particular infrastructure that capitalism has built, in particular the aviation industry, means that rather than coronavirus being a localized event in a very specific human community, within weeks or within months, it's become a global pandemic. Also, it's extraordinarily unfortunate, but because capitalism had to grow and because British imperialism almost turned in on itself, and the British state, the financial collapse in 2008 was turned from a crisis of capital into a crisis of the state, and in particular the crisis of the welfare state in the UK in particular, and across Europe and across the centre of capitalism. We completely destroyed all the resources and all the infrastructure that would have been necessary and extremely useful in making the population immune or protected against coronavirus. So it's a very direct effect of economic collapse, the decision to enforce austerity, the undermining of the NHS, the privatisation of care homes. Capitalism, in its need for ever greater human and natural resources, destroyed the very things we needed to protect ourselves against coronavirus. And extremely quickly, if capitalism is a virus, if we accept that metaphor, we can immediately say that there is a vaccine, and that vaccine we are seeing currently is
Comrade, to wrap up quickly.
Is socialism.
Thank you so much. Fantastic. At this point, we're going to have 15 minutes in smaller groups, which gives people a chance to unmute themselves and chat a little less rigid, less formally. So now we have some time for questions and discussions together, maybe informed by the discussions you had in your breakout groups. Charlie, go for it. Thank you.
And I'll just paste the questions in the chat as I speak, so that people can refer to them. I just thought I'd jump to question 2, because that was something which I thought in our breakout session we had some really interesting discussion on. And we were talking about the energy in the Black Lives Matter movement that is linking up already with calling out internal structural racism in the UK and US and in France as well. But also I think that the conclusion we drew was that linking that to anti-imperialism is going to be a big challenge, and linking it to sort of more than just international solidarity with internal structural racism is like the tactical challenge, the strategic challenge that we now face. Yeah, that was all I had to say.
Hi, Brendan was in our breakout group, which was great, and I was very disturbed by his analysis that the youth who are the climate strikers and the Black Lives Matter strikers see themselves as the last generation, and we could be going to a point of no return. This seems like a really urgent time to consolidate our campaigns or galvanize our energies. I know personally I felt really wiped out by this time. So I get charged up by meetings like this and hearing from people and helping to move forward. The thing I was saying in our little group was that over the years, people have shifted from Green Party to Labour to XR. And, I'm just hoping that this pandemic, the COVID and the Black Lives Matter, sort of brings things together so that people can see all the things that have been discussed in the talks today, that they are all part of the same problem, and it really can bring people together. So those were what came out of for me, out of the great breakout group.
Thank you, Zareen. So Nick, if you would like to unmute yourself, please.
We had a discussion mainly about 2, which was and some of the difficulties, although we could make the intellectual case about how we felt. Hazel was suggesting that we were that the links between anti-imperialism and the climate movement weren't necessarily that clear within a lot of the climate movement. But then we then started talking about some of the younger leaderships, and so I suppose maybe that was where we came to our answer to 1, which is that what Graham was saying about there being a new leadership coming through. I guess my question then to teachers is what your sense, or people, or generally, is what people's sense of where the kind of schools climate strikers are, the young people who were energized by that, like where they're at now.
Graham.
Okay, I was just talking in the last breakout session about how do you connect the COVID and the BLM, and well, it's been connected on the demonstrations for obvious reasons, that the higher death rate and so on, and the discussion around the risk assessment around actually doing the protest at all was actually quite an important political moment. And obviously us older ones probably felt our vulnerability to some extent to this disease by and the Bio family itself didn't want people to go on demonstrations, partly because Cheko's sister is a healthcare worker. She's been dealing with the healthcare emergency and the deaths from COVID in the emergency room. So it's been a very live, real thing for us. So I think the death toll is about 4,000 officially, and probably unofficially about 6,000 in Scotland. So it's comparable in numbers. It's slightly smaller because we had our COVID thing locked down earlier and more complete, but that's only luck. We didn't have test, track, and tracing at the beginning when we should have done. If we had done, we might have stopped a lot of healthcare workers, particularly social care workers who are largely BME in many parts of the country, from actually getting the disease and actually, unfortunately, spreading it to their patients. They're very vulnerable patients. So that's the truth that's out there, not said very often in public because we don't want to blame healthcare workers, but that's the truth. They've been unprotected. They didn't have PPE, they haven't been tested, so that's what's been going on. So there's a black question there about, well, should they be being put in the front line in that way? Maybe they should be given some days off. There needs to be a consideration in the management of healthcare that they're not put in the front line so often. So that's an argument to be made, and it has been made in the BLM protests. The other argument that's been made is about imperialism and climate. That's come across in some of these demonstrations around the Pan-African question of African resources, because there's a black-led movement talking about black lives everywhere across the world, whether it's the diaspora, the continent, or in America or here.
1 more minute, please.
It's made that connection very, very explicit that Africa's resources are not for sale. So some placards address those questions. So if we're talking about climate justice and also the nature of that movement, it's very different from the climate justice movement. The truth is that black people, by and large, in Glasgow certainly were completely absent from the climate demonstrations we've seen. And although climate activists undoubtedly would have been there in solidarity with BLM, these are two very distinct, different movements in which we are perhaps amongst the few people who are connecting that as revolutionary socialists. So it's really important that we are the ones who raise those issues and demands in those two movements.
Thanks, Graham. Taisies will be after Pete. I'm going to put in a little conversation starter because I was struck in Brendan's talk about capitalism as the virus. Okay, so part of the problem with capitalism is it's neutered our ability to respond to COVID. So by destroying our welfare states, for example, and also even on the level of the fact that we feel maybe isolated, we're atomized from each other by neoliberalism. And now by COVID, in a lot of ways, that's been a quite isolating experience. Following on really from Graham, what you were saying, perhaps we can think widely about these issues of welfare and collective responses as part of what we're saying. And I see Willie's got his hand up as well. So Pete first, please.
Hi. Yeah, I think maybe my comment kind of overlaps with the second part of this session, but I think it's probably quite important to say just now in terms of question 1 about just recovery and just transition. I mean, in one respect, we're in a really special time when the impact of both the pandemic and of Black Lives Matter is made a lot of people move their positions, move their thinking over these things. And yet, at the same time, there's also a large number of people who haven't. And a large number of working class people are experiencing the impact of the pandemic in terms of lost jobs or much greater pressure at work or when they return to work as well. And so, it's one of the things which I think needs to be developed on the left is there's a lot of talk about just recovery and just transition, but it's in a kind of abstract and aspirational way rather than actually looking at how kind of power and class organization actually is going to make that possible. And that's something I guess we will talk about in the second bit of this session. But the truth is that for a very large number of people, the transition they're experiencing at the moment is is a deeply unjust one, and that has all kinds of consequences for kind of overall politics.
Thanks, Pete. So we've got Willie and Tazy and about a minute or two left before we start with the second part of the discussion, the organising part. So Lou will keep me right. If we don't quite have time, then maybe we can think about fitting these comments into the second part. But Tazy, if you'd like to unmute yourself, please.
Yeah, we talked a bit in our group about like the idea of just transition or transition generally and Green New Deal and stuff. And I mentioned something about how I went to a talk organised by Scott E3 with the authors of A Planet to Win, and something that really struck me about like the way that they were talking about things was they were brilliant on like the detail of like what needed to materially change in the economy for the sake of reducing emissions and improving people's welfare. They were brilliant on coalition building, like how do you bring like healthcare workers and indigenous people and working class people generally and so on, like how do you bring all those narratives together into like a shared one about and like about how like that relates to like social reproduction. They were brilliant on that. And they were very good on the fact that the state is also, you know, is currently organising the economy in a certain way, and that way needs to change. What I thought they were had very little to say about really though was like strategy. I think there's like a real gap at the moment in how we talk about the Green New Deal. It made a lot more sense as a platform in relation to Corbynism, in relation to the Sanders campaign and so on. That made sense. But now we've got a situation where people still talk about a state-led bunch of reforms to reduce emissions and improve welfare, partly instead of talking about communism. But you know, they talk about a state-led transition. It's very much like the state as an agent that could be potentially benevolent and a different kind of rational, perhaps like pursue a completely different strategy. But no sense of where that is supposed to come from. And I think that means it loses an antagonism with the state that really needs to be embedded in climate politics. And there needs to be more of an idea of like how we win those transitions without assuming that at some point we'll have a policy maker who will do them.
I'd like to bring Ian in, and he's going to speak for 10 minutes to introduce our session about how we organise in response to coronavirus. Thank you, Ian.
Yeah, so I'm going to try and just give a quick overview of some of what's been going on. I'm sure I'll miss some stuff out, but I think it's useful just to remind ourselves the range and scale of the organising that has gone on in response to it to feed into the discussion. So obviously at the start of this, we had the huge upsurge of mutual aid to cover up the kind of failure of the state to provide for people's basic needs. You also had then quite a range of struggles around workplaces, but it was interesting the dynamism of that didn't come generally from those who were hit hardest by job losses and loss of hours and so on, but actually came from some of the stronger groups such as health workers. You saw the appearance of the coronavirus support group and workforce, the rise of Real News, which I think has played a very important role in generating international solidarity around coronavirus with their videos and Zoom meetings. There was the campaign to get any sort of lockdown in the first place, where, you know, whether you talk about workplaces, in particular the Shut the Sites campaign around construction and schools. But I would argue there's been a huge amount of less visible union activity around jobs, pay, safety, you know, PPE, but a lot more than that. And I think a lot of non-unionised workplaces, workers actually speaking up for themselves in a way that would have been unimaginable previously, people being motivated and legitimised by what was going on to speak up in relation to their employer. The clapping itself, you know, clearly was a mass action by people, obviously very ambiguous politically as to what that represented and varied. And then as the crisis has rolled on, the mutual aid, I think, started off unevenly, but probably became even more uneven. And as it tried to adapt to changing situations, some groups moving much more towards charity or service delivery for the state, others being much more open to politics, different attitudes to the kind of divide between helpers and the vulnerable, or whether this was genuinely about mutual solidarity. There's been very clearly growth of tenant organisation, people trying to prepare for the evictions as rent arrears build up and the ban on evictions gets lifted. The campaign around schools reopening involving parents and teachers. And again, as with the role health workers played early on, it was where workers were better organised, playing a key role. It wasn't the workers who were most hard hit in hospitality and some of the sectors that just closed completely. It's already been mentioned a few times today, the Build Back Better. You've had attempts by environmental groups to reorientate around the coronavirus crisis to make an argument for fundamental changes to the economy as we rebuild. But I would say there's been some really big gaps as well. There's been a very notable lack of resistance to mass job losses. I mean, millions of people have either lost their jobs entirely or lost hours. You've got the campaign around thousands of people at the highly unionised British Airways, where Unite's running a kind of PR campaign rather than any hint of any industrial struggle. Now, some of this, I think, has been shaped by the difficulties of organising during lockdown. For a long time, people not being willing to do physical protests, but even just face-to-face meetings, leafleting, basic tools we use for organising. I think some of the characteristics that's led to, though, it's been clear that quite small physical protests that were symbolic often got quite big press and social media profile, and I think that's something we should bear in mind about how we connect those kind of actions to more genuine mass actions. Earlier on people talked about the arms industry. Quite a small protest outside an arms plant potentially could have quite a big impact. I'd also argue that online campaigning has had far more impact than normal. So the plethora of petitions that have popped up, I think because governments and employers have themselves found it harder to judge the mood, they're nervous about how people are going to react and their ability to take control. They've paid a lot more attention to what would in normal times be seen as quite token and weak actions. There's been a huge growth of often very large online political meetings, hundreds and in some cases thousands joining meetings organised by a wide range of movement organisations, quite often taking advantage of going online with a much stronger international dimension than has previously been the case. And then all of this has been hit by Black Lives Matter, which I think is then testing the boundaries of what people are prepared to do during the pandemic. And of course, as people have alluded to, views differ, and what people are prepared to do will depend on both the issue and the prospects of success, but also their own personal vulnerability to the impact of the disease, whether they're caring for somebody vulnerable, those kind of questions. In terms of the kind of political context, it is clear that government support and credibility is waning, and is waning quite fast. All the polling around how people see the government handling the pandemic is falling off. Tory support in the polls, but I think an electoral focus is the last thing we need right now, but nonetheless it is significant that it's falling off. We've got the question of what will happen as a second wave hits. We've already got the R number in many areas hovering somewhere just below or around 1, and yet the government's pressing ahead with relaxing the limited lockdown measures. Will the easing of lockdown, as people feel freer to go about doing campaigning and protest activities, and more people get back into workplaces where they're able to engage with each other, will that be like lifting the lid on a pressure cooker, or will it be a kind of some sort of feeling of return to normal? Another factor that I think is feeding into that is the tensions with the devolved governments, where the ability of the government to pretend that it's simply following a single kind of coherent position around the science is constantly undermined by those tensions. we've got the reality of Brexit, with Brexit on World Trade Organisation terms seeming ever more likely still to come. Now, the economic impact of that is likely to be dwarfed by what we're already seeing with coronavirus, but undoubtedly that will lead to more arguments about how we rebuild and what the position of Britain in the world is from that. Labour, on the other hand, is rising in the polls, but losing credibility with the left over both its response from the leadership to both COVID and Black Lives Matter. We can expect mass layoffs as furlough begins to wind down. And I think it's useful to be clear what the timetable for that is. So from August, employers will start having to pay national insurance contributions and pensions. So a relatively modest
8 minutes, comrade, 2 more.
Contribution. From September, they start having to pay 10% of wages, and from October, 20% of wages. So the government's clearly trying to stagger this, but it's easy to see that employers who've just kept people on the basis of getting the furlough payments will be increasingly pressured either to force people back to work in unsafe conditions or to lay people off. Now, the article in the bulletin from the steering group argues that we're likely to see a mix of responses from the government of both austerity measures and stimulus aimed at business, and I think that's right. But comrades have been involved in a huge range of valuable campaigning already during this period, and this session's really aimed to discuss how we can both organise and promote Marxist politics and organisation as the various crises we're seeing develop.
We're going to go into breakout groups again. Okay, welcome back, everybody. I hope you had fruitful discussions in your breakout group. John Nicholson, would you mute yourself, please?
Yeah, hopefully unmuted. I just wanted to say I thought that was a good introduction to this session by Ian, and I know he said he might have left some things out. I think there were two possible there. One's around health campaigning in its own terms by those who've been opposing the privatisation of health service, pointing out the deficit. We had a bit of a discussion in our small group with some controversy about the importance, for example, of the alternative scientists and public health experts who formed themselves into campaigns against what's come out from the publicly recognised government SAGE and so on. And that's been quite important. The degree to which we can use that and publicise that may be slightly different, but it is there. And these have been good campaigners in Keep Our NHS Public and so on. And the second point, which linked with it, was around migration, because there's been a lot of campaigning going on around that, and it overlaps. There's been a victory on the surcharge for health workers, but it wasn't a victory for the surcharge for everybody, and it wasn't a victory for the migrants who've got no settled status at all, who are still liable to pay, for example, £6,500 for a pregnancy delivering a baby in a hospital. And that's there have been campaigns against that which have continued and are continuing within the context of health. So I think these are extra things that we can look at and provide some profitable outcomes for us in terms of campaigning.
Thanks, John. Right, Hazel.
Yeah, so it was on the third question about what can RS21 or RS21 members do. And this isn't very theoretical, this is just a bit of a summary of what I think the practical things that we could all be doing at the moment and how we could intervene as a relatively small organisation. One is make things collective. So there's constantly individual parents saying they're going to take an individual decision not to send their kids to school, or individual workers wanting support with their case, and constantly bring that conversation back to, have you spoken to this wider group of people who are in the same position as you? Because that's mind-blowing to people who've never thought that way before. So that's the first one, make everything collective. Second one is know the enemy. And so we'll all see petitions and campaigns going on everywhere that are targeting the wrong enemy at the moment. And so tracking things back to, actually, it's not that head teacher, it's the local authority or the government, or tracking it back to who the real enemy is, and help people target their anger and their campaigns more effectively. The power dynamic, I think there's huge potential to shift it now. And in conversations where people are starting to write to their MP or ask for the schools to close or ask for something to happen, telling people that they have power to make those decisions themselves and that they can close their schools and they can collectively organise and stop it. They don't have to ask someone else in authority to do it. They can have some power themselves. The fourth, I think, is going to the leaders. So all of the Black Lives Matter protests that sprung up. The Carlisle one was not organised by any of us who always organise the protests at all. And so for all of us, go and have a socially distanced coffee straight away afterwards with the people who organise those protests and get to know those people and their movements and what's driving them, and just get in amongst the new networks. And then the fifth one, I think, is sort of one thing we can all do very effectively is join up the campaigns. So if you're organising something about workers' rights in coronavirus or the schools, don't just have parents there, have the parents and the teachers there, and a health worker and a transport worker, and have those links between all of the campaigns across the different sectors.
I just want to make a point about the workplace. I mean, I think the contribution in the last session around key workers is really crucial, and I think we all recognise that. And I think some thought needs to be given about how we make that kind of resistance more effective. But I want to talk about a more general experience, which I think will become important, increasingly important, as people are forced back to the workplace. I've been at work for now about 5 weeks as a so-called essential worker in defence. And what's become apparent quickly is that the management are as clueless, really, as the Tory government when it comes to developing an approach for dealing with the pandemic in the workplace. And so that, in workplaces across the country, throws up opportunities. I mean, we have had some walkouts. I mean, Ian mentioned earlier that there have been attempts at that and some of them have been successful. But where there isn't an appetite or confidence to walk out or walk off the job, there is opportunities for socialists to organise around health and safety. Health and safety reps are going to become critical in the coming period in every workplace. And the questions of risk assessments, hygiene, cleanliness regimes are going to be crucial. I've found where I am that despite the senior reps who are worse than the trade union bureaucracy in my place, and sometimes worse than the management, in fact, we've been able to agitate around the risk assessments not being adequate. And when you've got a workforce that is also worried about the pandemic and worried about their own welfare, there's real opportunities for rebuilding workplace organisation around health and safety issues. And so it's risk assessments and the cleanliness regimes. Where workplaces have outsourced the cleaning, which is, you know, most workplaces, the cleaners, as we all know, are undervalued and under-resourced, and the budgets are inadequate. And I've found out in my place, there's been no extra money put into cleaning, and we're agitating around that. And so there's a question of organising your own members around health and safety, cleanliness, and there's also the question around organising the cleaners, and with a view to developing an argument about bringing outsourced workers back in-house. So I think there's loads of opportunities around this where you've got low levels of organisation, poor organisation or none to agitate around health and safety.
Yeah, good point. That's a good question, right? Because in our group, people were talking about there's mass layoffs and they're happening now. People are being made redundant now. And by the way, when people are made redundant, then even though folk might be brought back to work less hours, they'll be expected to do more work. So yeah, that's a good question of how we organise around that, and that's a useful idea. Ray, Mike Downham is next. Roderick after that. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Very briefly, fitting in with Ray around health and safety, going back to saving lives, which still has to be our first political, not only moral obligation. There is one point which I think is inadequately publicised, is inadequately understood about the so-called science, and that is the point which is that in a few weeks' time, we're going to be in a much better position to judge what at the moment is an extremely difficult thing for people to judge in terms of their actions about whether the kids should go back to school, whether they should go back to work, to what extent they should agitate for better health and safety at work. And that is the robustness or not of our TTI system. Everything depends in terms of risk on how good our TTI system is. At the moment, it's not good. It's likely to be better in a few weeks' time. So I think that very limited short-term message is something that I'd like to see RS21 coming behind.
Yeah, good point. Thanks. We've got Roderick's indicated next. I'm going to throw another thing in the mix here for people to think about in case anyone has questions or small points that they want to raise, because we've got 15 minutes left, 14 and a bit, about equalities, because it seems to me like as a nursery worker that it's women's work really, you know, quote unquote, that is coming to the fore. It's caring work, you know, things that have been, like people are saying about cleaners and, you know, work that's been invisible, that's undervalued, that's underpaid, shop workers. It turns out that they're the most important jobs. So perhaps that in terms of justice, we'll think about the intersection to do with gender as well as well as everything else, BIM, people and justice and the environment. So Roderick, if you'd like to unmute yourself, please.
Thank you for reminding me to unmute, because I tend to forget to do that.
You're welcome.
I want to talk about the second question, really, because that's the thing that interests me. I mean, some of you may know that I've been banging on the Facebook group about how we don't talk about strategy enough. And trying to write an article about Labour Party and the possibility of Labour Party split. Now, I don't want to go into all that, but I want to talk about something more specific, which is that I think we're going to go through an extended period of crisis. I think that's definite. There's likely to be massive struggles. We've talked about some of the ways, some of the routes from which that may come. I could also mention rent strikes, which is another possibility. And there's after that, of course, the climate crisis is also worsening. So we're talking about a level of crisis that is challenging the very basics of the capitalist system over the next coming period. And that throws up the whole possibility of the whole question of new forms of revolutionary organization and where they might come from. And in this country, there's a problem, because I don't think they're going to come from small groups like us amalgamating. I don't think they're going to come from the SWP. I don't think they'll come out magically out of nowhere. I think, to be honest with you, the only way I can see new revolutionary organizations that have any chance of a mass base being formed is out of a split in Labour, with sections of Labour left walking away from the Labour Party and then being radicalized over time through extended periods of struggle. But I would like to know what people think about this. Do people actually think that, you know, this is just not, that it'll come from somewhere else, or even that this is not even a question we should even begin to think about? If so, why should we think about it? Because it seems to me like it'd be an obvious thing to think about. I mean, Colin made the point, I think, on a post on Facebook the other day about America, that it poses the question as to new organizations that are independent of the two main parties in America. I think the same question is posed here. So, you know, what do we think about
1 minute, please, comrade.
That's it, that's all I've got to say.
Willie, you can unmute yourself, please.
Yeah, I agree with what Raymond was saying about individuals fighting back and that issue, and where you are, you fight. So if it's on health and safety, but I think that we're looking at how do we mobilize class fighters? How do we mobilize and get to the situation where our class is visible as an organized class for itself and in itself? And I think that we will have opportunities, because we know, and some of the comrades mentioned it, that the Tories and the bosses are daft. They make wrong decisions because they're under pressure from their side. So they're under pressure to try and return to the normal situation, but they can't. So they do introduce things like, oh, I think we're going to introduce a 2-year wage freeze. This brings in everybody. Any hospital, any airport, any place where there's lots of workers, and that is where women and men and different races fight back in themselves together against the imposition of wage freeze. Can you imagine if we go out of lockdown and we are back in a situation where they're not going to pay for the NHS, or they're not going to pay, or they're going to hold the wages down of workers who have saved millions? To be honest, this is the possibility. Whether it's going to happen or not, will be dependent on a lot of things. But I'll tell you what, if sections of workers in different places call for united action, when in I think it was Manchester, Unite called it, and others called the TUC called the demonstration, got 50,000. Can you imagine the situation if we were talking about a march in defence of the NHS, only in safe conditions, exactly, and the rest? So I think that what we're going to be seeing is a potential for our class to mobilise. There's other things, but I'll just shut up at that.
Okay, Charlie, do you want to unmute yourself, please?
Done. Am I loud enough?
Yes.
Can people hear me? Yep, cool. Okay. I just wanted to come back on what Roderick said, because I think there's a problem about waiting for something like that to happen, but there's also a question of what the outcome might actually look like, because we have had very significant splits from social democratic parties in Germany with Die Linke and in France with movement around Mélenchon. And what you've had is people who are reformists and or social democrats thinking that the current organisation that they're in is not good enough at being reformist and wanting a better reformist organisation. I mean, you also have the additional problem that they're over centralised on one particular person, which in France is particular, which in France with Mélenchon is particularly a problem. But so I think we need to think much more about the politics of the situation. And I also think it's useful to disentangle the states here. The point is, in the States, you have two capitalist parties. To have a break from that and have a party that says we are a party that stands for working people, however poor, reformist, or inadequate their politics are, would actually be a very important break. To have a second reformist party in Britain, we've already got one. A second one isn't much of a step forward. And I just quickly on the point Andy Wynne made, I do think that the Chris Williamson thing is a wholly dead end, not quite as toxic possibly as Galloway's operation, but the same sort of basic idea. And it's worth noting that both of them, Williamson and Galloway, have been horrendous around Black Lives Matter. And actually it's as Sadie raised, the truth is that the American movement around Bernie Sanders, more particularly the DSA.
One more minute, please, comrade.
Okay, have not been good around Black Lives Matter. They've not been able to jump to occasion. So I mean, I don't think that splitting Labour is likely, but I also don't think it's going to produce anything fundamentally. People aren't going to jump to being revolutionaries simply by making organisation changes. That's about politics.
Thanks, Charlie. Isabel, you're next.
Hi, thanks.
Isabel, yeah, thanks.
Yeah, I just want to say something about some of the change that has already happened. Obviously, the government is feeling under pressure and worried about public opinion and public reaction. Some of the change that has happened has been through things like petitions, which before wouldn't have had such a rapid effect, which is good because, of course, striking's kind of hard at the moment, particularly if they're trying to push more people to work at home. So yeah, if you think about it in terms of a strike, the government's obviously rather worried about how people are reacting and more sensitive than usual to public opinion.
Just to say that I think Roderick raises a really important point, and I say this as an SNP councillor, so I'm doing that work with a reformist party here that supports independence. If I was in England, I would be in the Labour Party, because if there was any likelihood, I think it's generally right that a large revolutionary force is not going to just spontaneously emerge only. It will require an intervention into reformist parties. The question, though, is there likely to be one in the short term? And I reckon there won't be. If you were joining the Labour Party, I think you'll be there for a while, because I don't think a significant number of people will leave it this side of them having a possibility in 4 years' time of becoming a government. I think history shows that. I mean, plus we've been there, those of us who've been Labour Party members, or those of us in the SWP at the time when Kinnock was around, remember there was an exodus of people then at the time in response to neoliberalism then under the Major government. And okay, the SWP stood there at the doors while people were leaving, but they didn't recruit that many people. And that happened again and again in other examples. The exception, the best exception probably is the SSP. That's the only exception where there was a serious, sizable split in the working class to another party, and revolutionaries and socialists and reformists worked together to create a centrist combat party, essentially. That was a unique set of circumstances which existed for a while, and unless something like that occurs in England and Wales, I don't see that very likely in the short term. It could happen down the line, but it won't happen without first solidarising with the battles inside the Labour movement first, because I think that there's a strong Labour left movement there to try and stop the way Keir Starmer is going to the right. And I think most of those people are going to stay put. And most of the ones who leave are unfortunately going to not come straight to revolutionary politics. They're going to dissipate to the four winds unless there's a movement out there that gives them some optimism that the revolutionaries have something serious to say to them. So I think strategically, Odik's asking the right question, but I think the answer is that it won't happen in the short term, the split in the reformist movement.
Yeah, apologies. I was going to come in on the Labour thing as well, and absolutely we should pick that up this afternoon. But I guess two very quick points I'd make on it. I do think it's one of the right questions, but I think that it's actually united struggle that creates the potential for, mass revolutionary organisation. And the history of building mass revolutionary organisations isn't simply of splits from reformism. Historically, there have been groups of syndicalists, for example, or from other movements who've become revolutionary and generalised into an anti-capitalist, socialist revolutionary position in various countries. So I think the key thing is, and this is why I think it is relevant to this session, is to look for united struggles we can make, whether it's people who've stayed in Labour or people who are breaking from Labour, where we can jointly engage in activity with them over the struggles today. And that's what also then gives the potential to try and break people from reformism. Now, we can't wish these things into existence. At the moment, I agree with Graham, there's almost no prospect of a significant break from Labour. I just don't think that's the dynamic. What there is big movements happening. Black Lives Matter taken to the streets in huge numbers, the biggest demonstrations many people can remember in their towns. You've got the climate movement, you're going to have stuff around COVID and the economy. There's huge potential for struggles that undermines the argument that the people who just want to cling on to the wreckage of Corbynism are saying that there's no alternative, that electoralism is the only possible focus. And that's why, to some extent, I do think it's relevant to this session to be talking about those struggles.